Hello, everyone. I'm Orly Adin, the director of VTIF. VTIF is a year-round film organization, and normally we host physical events, but these days we're operating a virtual cinema. I hope you've all had time to watch our film, A Towering Task, The Peace Corps, before today's discussion, but really no worries if you haven't. It's still going to be available online on vtif.org. And I'm delighted to welcome today our two interviewees, Nancy Bercaw, who is zooming in from Vermont, and KJ Hunt, known as KJ, zooming in from Hawaii. Nancy was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya in '86 and '87, and she's written about her experiences in two of her memoirs, Dry Land and Brain in a Jar. KJ has served in the US Peace Corps 3 times, first in Kenya in '86, then Armenia in 2017, and then Ethiopia in 2019, where last March she was evacuated from. She currently lives in Hawaii and is applying for a position with the Peace Corps. And now I would like to turn the conversation over the mic to Nancy and then to KJ and hear what they have to say and their connection to the Peace Corps and to the film. Nancy, please.
Okay, thanks, Orly. Hi, KJ.
Hi.
I haven't seen you since Tanzania last year. Anyway, I joined Peace Corps right out of college, 1986. I had a degree in English education, and I was very excited to go. The process is long and purposefully confusing. I think they want to test your flexibility at every turn. My first assignment that they gave me was going to be South Yemen. I was excited about that. But a month later, they called. It's when we still use the telephone, and we called people to tell them what was happening. And they said, no, you're going to go to the Seychelles. And I was very happy about that. Islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean sounded perfect to me. Then a month later, they called and said, no, you're going to Kenya, and you're leaving in a week. And I was like, okay, I can take it. That sounds perfect. So flew me to Philadelphia, flew KJ, and Pam O'Callahan, who's on the line here, all of us in that group, Peace Corps 1986 Kenya, were all flown to Philadelphia for 3 days of training. And then we were flown to Kenya, where we all stayed for varying lengths. I did what was called an early termination because of many reasons, and we can talk about that later, but certainly one was chronic illness and a little bit of despair. So we can talk about that later. I think if you watch the film, you'll see what a lot of Peace Corps volunteers grapple with, because it can be really hard on the psyche and the body. And actually, I was really glad that the film addressed that. So now I'll give it to my lifelong friend, and that's a great side effect of Peace Corps, is the people that you meet see the worst and the best of you, and you're safe with them for the rest of your life. So here's my safety line, KJ, to tell you about her experience.
Thanks, Nance. So I've never been a traditional Peace Corps volunteer. I was 30 years old when I left for Peace Corps Kenya. I was working in Washington, DC. Live Aid happened because of the famine in Ethiopia. I watched all weekend, like most of America did. And that Monday morning when I went to work, I walked to the Peace Corps office in DC and I applied. And then I went back and traveled around, did all the things you do before you're going into the Peace Corps, and I left that October of the following year for Peace Corps Kenya. And I remember Nancy jumping rope in the hallway. Bump, 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 bump. And then I did the entire service. I left a little bit early because you could leave 90 days early if you were going to attend college. And so I've been accepted into a graduate school program in Ohio. So I left 90 days early. And then I had a career, I retired, and I decided to go back into the Peace Corps. And they sent me to Armenia, which is in Eastern Europe. And so I'm part of that group. And I don't feel that bad because I served in Africa. So I think it's okay that I served in Eastern Europe. And I served there for 2 years. I lived with my host family for the entire 2 years. And then I had a month off. I had to get a malaria test for Ethiopia. And finally, after all those years, I was sent to Peace Corps Ethiopia. And we served about 9 months and we were evacuated. And so watching the film and how, Peace Corps was started and being, a part of Peace Corps' evacuation worldwide is extremely interesting. So now I've applied for Peace Corps Response. Response is not the full 27 months. It's more consultant sort of work. And you go for a set amount of time, 3 months, 9 months, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or 12. And this will be an assignment in Jamaica and it'll be for 9 months.
Yeah. I was wondering, the two of you, as you were watching the film, I mean, obviously your first assignment, if that's what it's called, was in the 80s. So 20 something years after the Peace Corps was established. And just by watching the film, it seemed to me what it was proposing, the film, was that in the 80s, the Peace Corps was a very different animal than when it was first established. So you probably don't have much, you can't compare it with the previous eras, decades, but maybe as you were watching the film, I was wondering what your thoughts were about how it was for you. How similar was it to the original ideas of it and so on? Either of you.
KJ, I'll just say what it was like in 86 and then you take it from there. How's that?
Yeah.
I think at that time we had a lot of liberties. Peace Corps was by then, almost 30 years old.
25.
20 years old. 20 years old.
Yeah.
They worked out some of the kinks, but not all of them. And of course, we didn't have social media and we didn't have phones, so it was hard to keep track of us. And some of us Peace Corps volunteers, speaking for myself, I enjoyed not being kept track of. So I would, take some extended vacations in other places or get on a couple of trains and go to the coast and see friends. They couldn't really track you. But they did come and check on you. And if you weren't at your school, there was a little trouble. But it just, by virtue of not being the way things are now, I think we were more open to do whatever we want. KJ?
Yeah, and I was born in 1956. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. And so it's not that I was conscious of JFK being on the steps of the Michigan Union making that speech. But certainly after his assassination, you can only imagine if you're in Michigan, all of that footage is just in rotation constantly. And so being a kid from Michigan, growing up in Detroit, Peace Corps was probably always on my sort of bucket list. I do remember it going into action. I remember those ads from the film. When I saw that, I was like, oh my God, I remember, I remember seeing those. But I think for me, it wasn't so much that Peace Corps was no longer about world peace or about sending young people fresh out of college, because like I said, I was never a traditional volunteer. My first assignment, I was 30. For me, it was an event. And so the event for me was the famine in Ethiopia. And that's the thing that drove me sort of into Peace Corps. And then after that, I'm a part of the 50-plussers, the volunteers who are older, who decide to go back into Peace Corps. Some of it is a retirement strategy. Some of it, people never had the chance to be a volunteer and they always wanted to do it. But there are a lot of people like myself who've done Peace Corps before, and then they decide to go back into Peace Corps. And it's funny, Nancy was talking about how, we're still all together after all these years. We have a friend, Rebecca, that we served with. And I was in Armenia and I went to England for Christmas holiday and I stayed with Rebecca. And she said, "You did exactly what you said you would do when we were in training." And I didn't know I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "When we were in training in Kenya, you said when you retired, you were going to go back into the Peace Corps, and you did exactly what you said you were going to do." So these things sort of happen. And I wanted to do back to back because I retired at 60, and I just didn't want to necessarily try to figure out what to do financially or where I was going to live. I still don't know where I'm going to live. So I very purposely signed up for Peace Corps at 60 in order to do it back to back. And so I'm as shocked as anyone that I'm back in the United States before September of next year. So
I find it interesting, and I can see how that happens, and you can feel it even with the vibes between those of you here on my screen, you know, who had been, who had served together and so on, this long, lifelong friendship and so on. But these are friendships between the people, the Peace Corps people, the US Peace Corps people who went out to other countries. I'm curious to know about friendships that might have, you know, developed, and do they still exist with the people in the places you served, in the communities you served?
Of course, that is the perfect question. And there was, when I left Kenya in '87, my situation was that I was extremely rural, western province of Kenya, what was the AIDS and malaria basin. I was fortunate, I never got malaria, but I pretty much had chronic diarrhea. And when you're a Peace Corps volunteer, you talk about diarrhea a lot. So for those of you who weren't volunteers and you're here today, I apologize, but it's what we do. But it was enough to really make me suffer. And I didn't have you know, I had a drop bathroom outside, just a hole in the ground. And one time there was a black mamba that slithered past, which is one of the most deadly snakes in the world. And I just sort of hit this threshold of tolerance. And at the same time, I was very taken aback by the suffering of the people that I lived with. What I was going through paled in comparison to just the chronic disease that I saw around me. And it really felt very heavy. And I had the classic Peace Corps existential crisis of, what am I doing here? Why am I teaching English? What does this matter? Who am I helping? Maybe me, not anyone else. So I left. And then for a while, I didn't have much contact with my school or my village. But my father did, because we created a library there, and he raised money through his Rotary group, and we built this library. And then slowly, as I sort of got over the guilt of leaving and got a little more grown up, I started to redevelop a relationship with my school. And 3 years ago, I took my husband and son back to Maragoli to see my school, and was given the most extraordinary welcome. I mean, I almost can't talk about it without crying. The children, the new children, of course, sang. The people who remembered me, the old headmaster drove up on a motorcycle and was waving. Mwalimu, a teacher, and we hugged, and it was just unbelievable. But what I saw was that the village hadn't changed much. There was still no running water. There was still almost the same degree of suffering. And at that point, I started a scholarship fund through my friend Anne that lives in Maragoli. And she was going to join us tonight, but Kenya, I think it's 3 a.m. And so she is the administrator of a fund that's in my family's name, named for my father, that supports 8 students and pays their school fees. So I am more connected than ever to the place I was.
My situation for Kenya was a little bit different. In 1985, my mother sold her home in Detroit for $2,000 to the family next door, and moved herself into a Section 8 senior citizens facility, sort of by Belle Isle in Detroit, overlooking Canada, which is something only my mother would be able to do. So I was backpacking in Europe, as one does when they're, from the hood of Detroit, happy as a lark. And I called a friend who was supposed to join me. And he said, I have good news and I have bad news. And I said, you're not coming to Europe. He said, no, but I know where your mother lives. She had gone through her phone book and called everyone in the phone book to say that she had gone. So Nancy and I both have dementia, Alzheimer's in our family, her dad, my mom. And so I know like the moment of getting that call. So Peace Corps for me was like one of the last things I was going to get to do before I was really going to have to bunker down with my mom and dementia. I mean, she had put herself in a place where she was safe. They had Meals on Wheels. And so she was fine. I, of course, was financially ruined because everything that you do for your mom's house, like the, porch that's been converted into a bedroom, the washer dryer, the roof that was, fixed, all of the things that you charge, you now still have to sort of pay for. So Peace Corps Kenya in many ways was like an absolute escape. So when Peace Corps was over, I had to go home and sort of deal with that situation. And so I never really made contact again with where I was in Kenya. But that being said, I was the only person on my compound. I was the first volunteer. No one had ever served there before. I lived at the school. They had 3 little houses. I had one as my house. Teachers used the one at the end to cook lunch. And so I really didn't have a community. I could see the smoke coming up where people were cooking. And I knew I had neighbors around, but there was really not the same contact if you live in a village or in a compound with other people. Armenia, completely different. I went there on my site visit to my permanent site. I was there 3 days, and the little girl who was 15 and a straight A student asked her mom to call the school and say she was sick so she could stay home with me until I left, even though she knew I was coming back. And I thought to myself, I have to stay with this family, I have to stay with these kids.
I think we are. KJ, are you still with us?
KJ, you froze.
I think you have frozen. So until she's probably trying to unfreeze herself. We can't do anything about it. So I just like to remind everyone, including this meme of Robin Lloyd in her anti-nuclear mode, that please write on the chat, in the chat section of Zoom, write questions, and you will definitely, we're going to make time for you to ask questions and to be replied to, I hope. I think KJ is probably trying to reconnect. So meanwhile, Nancy, there's a lot in the film about how, well, first of all, how some of the presidents, the US presidents, were actually against the whole idea of the Peace Corps and so on. They didn't see it as valuable. And then suddenly again, they did, in the Reagan era, because it was trying to win hearts and minds and so on. And the whole political thing, there's a scene there with somebody who wrote a postcard and was saying things aren't so great here. And it was immediately a big scandal. So the controlling of it, I kind of was curious if at any point, either in your training or if supervisors came to check on you, did you feel, or maybe you were too young to be aware, but in retrospect, that you had a mission beyond just helping others and maybe helping yourselves, being a kind of like almost an agent of the US or a spokesperson, trying to get people up to first world. Yeah. So sorry, KJ, we lost you. So meanwhile, I asked Nancy a question. We still can't hear you. You're muted. So Nancy, maybe you could just relate to that, and then KJ.
Right.
Okay.
Going in, I didn't have any preconceived notions about anything. But in Peace Corps training, I can't remember if it was when we were stateside or if we were in Kenya. But I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, KJ or Betty, but I pretty distinctly remember our trainers saying, both our Kenyan trainers and our American trainers saying, just don't do the political thing. Don't talk about Kenya politics. Don't talk about American politics. Just leave it. And that was okay by me. And it wasn't until I got to my site and started to live there, I felt the unbearable lightness of the responsibility. Just this, I may be the only American anybody has ever met here, and maybe the only one for a long time. What are they going to think of my country based on my actions? But then part of me was like, but I need 27 beers to get through the weekend. So you're always kind of thinking, I should be a good ambassador. But then you're also like, I'm a human and this is weird. And I kind of want to go see my friends this weekend and I can't totally handle the pressure. And then around Kenya, when you tell people you're a Peace Corps volunteer, some Kenyans would say, are you CIA? By then that was, and I had that in private jobs in Korea. I've had that in the Middle East, not entirely surprising, but that myth, which may have been true at some point, that Peace Corps volunteers were CIA was still pervasive throughout Kenya and the world, I believe.
Yeah. And KJ, I mean, you can gather from what I said, the tone of my question.
Yeah. Oh, I don't know if Nancy remembers, but I asked during our stay in Philadelphia about Peace Corps and the CIA. And after I asked that question, they called me aside when whatever that group session was over, and they said, you need to stop asking things like that. And that's when we were in Philadelphia. So I wasn't political when I was in Peace Corps, because by 1986, I really wasn't that American. And by that, I mean, I remember in '84, my first flight on my own, I was in the military, so I've, flown on military planes. But on my first solo flight to Heathrow, they gave me the custom form and it said nationality. And I was like, what do I put down? I mean, do I put down American? Am I even allowed to put down American? No one's ever called me American. And so I looked at the guy next to me who was white and he put USA. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna put USA. And if I get, kicked out of Heathrow, I just go back to the United States. So for me in Kenya and Peace Corps and all three of my services, it's been more being African American, or in my case, Black American, than it was me trying to uphold something about America. In Armenia, I took a lot of photos. I tell people I'm the David Beckham of African American volunteers. You want a photo, I just take the photo. Younger volunteers were like, I'm not a monkey in a zoo. I don't know these people. Why do they want a photo of me? But for me, it was, I don't know what these people think about Americans. And I certainly don't know what they think about African Americans after music, TV shows, movies, whatever. And so in a way, I just felt like I was a representative of Black America. And if you've never met an African American before, then today's your day. Let's talk about what you want to talk about. Hi, I tried to be as friendly as I could, but I can't remember any instance where something political was going on. And part of that is you're so at the village level, you're so at your community level. And so if it could be a national big deal, but it may not necessarily ever trickle down to your day to day. So the people that you're greeting when you leave your door to go to the outhouse or may not ever come up to you with any political statements. They do recently, they all want to know what we think about Trump. I will say that. And in most cases, they love Donald Trump and think it's, think that's just hysterical.
Sometimes it's not, sometimes it's not directly political. It's not
Right.
like you were given a specific ideology.
Exactly.
This is what you have to instill in
Mhm.
wherever you are.
Can I make a statement? This is Betty.
Yes, please do.
I was in Peace Corps with Nancy and with Karen, and the site I was at, they were expecting a white woman. I show up, and I'm very light skinned. I had to prove to them, no, I'm not a white woman. In the training group behind us, there was an African American from Michigan who came and stayed with me. She brought magazines to show them that we come in all shades. And the reason they thought that I was a white woman is because it was a white volunteer who was supposed to come to that site. Originally, I was supposed to go to Homa Bay, which was malaria country, right in the freaking heart of malaria country.
Zero.
And at the, at the last minute, they're like, no, you're going to stay in Kisumu. We're going to send you to another site. And that's where all of that got started.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hey, Betty.
One sort of strange thing happened to me, and this may be pervasive throughout Peace Corps Kenya, I don't know, but one of my students told me, because you're here and you're teaching us, our bride price has gone up.
Mm.
So that's political, and I found that really troubling, and a weird expectation weirdness, but learning from an American at your school made the women more valuable on the wife market. And I still can't really articulate that very well because it makes me so uncomfortable, but there are side effects to being a volunteer.
Yeah, and one thing that you have is we're not mandated reporters, and now more than they said it when we were in Kenya, you are sort of drilled. You're not a mandated reporter. So if your children at school are being beaten, you are out of that. And if a teacher at your school is having sex with young girls at your school, that's a conversation between you and Peace Corps, whether you want to stay at the site, but there's really nothing that you are supposed to do as a volunteer. And so I don't know if that's being pushed, because as you show in the film of the volunteer who was murdered after sending an email to Peace Corps about her students having sex with a teacher at the school. But today it's really drilled that you're not a mandated reporter. So some of the things that volunteers are trying to grapple with, if you've not grown up with corporal punishment, if you don't understand that there's no high school at your school that does 11th and 12th grade because your girls are basically going to be married by the time they're 15 to someone who's probably twice their age. Those are the sort of political-ish things that you go through as a volunteer on a sort of day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I wonder, I see we have Aubrey here, who was also a volunteer. Aubrey, did you see the film? Would you like to add anything or comment? If you want to unmute yourself. Yep.
Hi, Aubrey. So I served with KJ in Ethiopia, myself, Kim, and Racine hiding on here. But I did watch the film today. I thought it was really interesting just to kind of learn about the history and all the steps that Peace Corps has gone through and the impacts of each of the different administrations over the decades. I found very interesting. I love that no matter what, you know, the organization always persevered and made it through those tough presidencies, you know, times when they weren't getting the funding. But it was just really interesting to see. As a recent volunteer, it was kind of emotional to watch. Really kind of just made me want to go back as soon as possible. But it was really interesting to watch. It was a great film.
What made you decide to volunteer, Aubrey?
I looked in, can you hear okay with these earbuds? Okay.
Yeah.
I looked into the Peace Corps. So I'm just 44, and I looked into the Peace Corps right out of college in my early 20s, and wasn't quite ready then. The information talk that I went to spent most of the talk talking about evacuating you from Africa. And I was like, I'm not ready for that. And then, so I was laughing with my friend recently who I went to that meeting with. I was like, here I am 20 years later being evacuated from Africa. I was like, and it had always kind of stuck with me. And when I finished grad school 2 years ago, I thought it was a great opportunity since I was in between careers to finally go for it. And I'm very happy that I did.
Nice to meet you, Aubrey. We had a volunteer in our group named Aubrey, and I was looking at you at first thinking, Aubrey has aged.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Are there any Peace Corps volunteers in the field right now, or are all evacuated?
All are evacuated. It's weird to go to the website and when you go through the map and it's like 0 in country, 0 in country. It was really weird to see that. And I mean, that was immediately updated because I checked a couple, like a week, within that week of us getting back, and everything was set to 0.
Yeah.
That's a
and
first.
they got us out pretty quick. They got us out really fast. I think within 10 days, all 7,000 plus volunteers were basically back in the United States. So everybody went.
I had a feeling when I was watching the film, not having been in the Peace Corps, so I just came it as a kind of historical thing that interests me generally about relationships between countries around the world with, you know, inequality and so on. That I felt I wanted to hear more interviews or chats in the film with the people on the ground, not the volunteers, but the people on the ground. There was a little bit in the film, but not much. You didn't really get a sense of, I didn't get a sense anyway, of what, okay, apart from being upgraded as a, you know, a super bride instead of a, you know, maybe low grade bride that you mentioned, Nancy, what was in it for them? What did they get out of it? And more so, you know, did it last? And you may not have answers to that. And I see Racine as, so we suddenly see a picture. I don't know if you were a peace volunteer, were you?
Yes, she was.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. Aubrey was saying how we're hiding our faces. So I was like, yeah. Okay, I'll turn my video on. But yes, I served with KJ, Karen Jean, and Aubrey and Tim. We were all in Ethiopia.
So, you know, I can see how there are all kinds of reasons why people would volunteer, especially when you're very young. You want to get away from home, you want freedom, you want to find your place in life. I totally get that. And maybe later it's for other reasons, you know, and we're not into kind of analyzing psychologically why people volunteer. But beyond that personal need, what use is it? Do you see what I mean? I really trying to understand, and I didn't feel that the film really answered that, unless everybody was a CIA agent and, you know, was acting on behalf of Reagan or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's really still the unanswerable question. Do we have a meaningful impact on anything but ourselves? And I think as a personal answer, I'd love to just see a film totally devoted to places Peace Corps volunteers were. Like, that could be a whole other narrative. I, interestingly, for a long time, I just didn't see the value. I just lamented it. I grappled with it. I thought, you know, it's a tragedy that it's likely that nobody in my village of Maragoli will ever go to college. It seems impossible. It seems unlikely. Maragoli at one point was the most densely populated place in the entire world. Thousands of years of cutting farmland down to the smallest, more densely populated than Bangladesh. It's just known as, even in Kenya, if you say you live in Maragoli, they say in Swahili, pole sana, I'm so sorry. Cut to 3 years ago, I went to Ajman University in the Middle East. We're talking about going and recruiting. And I said, why don't we go to Kenya and recruit for college? And I said, is there any professor on this staff from Kenya? And they said, yes, we have one, Dr. Joe. And I said, I want to talk to Dr. Joe, and he and I will go to Kenya and recruit. And Dr. Joe walked in, and we spoke a little Swahili, and I said, where are you from? And he has a PhD in business administration from LSU. He said, I'm from Maragoli. Now, I was not his teacher, but suddenly I was like, why did I think that nobody from Maragoli could go to college? Who am I to think that? And here standing before me is the evidence that Maragolis are everywhere doing everything. So the Peace Corps keeps educating me. I keep learning, and I also keep seeing impact. I mean, Dr. Joe is not an impact, but I see things I didn't see before. And here I am sharing those with you all and maybe other people. So maybe there's an impact there.
I think there is an impact, and I think you showed it in the film when you were interviewing the woman who's in community service in the Dominican Republic, and she's relaying the story about how the volunteers went and took a truck and went to care and came back with food.
Yeah.
She was in tears.
Yeah.
And you think, how many years ago did that happen? And she was having a very difficult time relaying that story. And even, you know, the ambassador with the Reagan meeting with Fiji, and Reagan's like, no, don't cut the Peace Corps budget. That was the only thing I was thanked for last week. Right. As volunteers, you always are told those stories. And the people who serve with me in Ethiopia can definitely attest to this. They will always come up with a story of someone in a village, Peace Corps volunteer shows up, and they'll say, do you know Miss Nancy? And you'll be like, Miss Nancy. And then they'll tell you the story of this volunteer who came to Maragoli, you know, whatever, and served. And so just like so few Americans ever go into the Peace Corps, number one, and so few people around the world are ever touched by the Peace Corps, there are those cases that just live on and on and on and on. And you never know who you're going to impact. And I would always say to people, it may never be your students. It may not be one of your students. It may be the sister or brother of one of your students who's going to remember, I remember that lady was here when I was 3 and they told me she was from America. So I'm going to work and one day I'm going to get to America. I mean, we're Americans, so we want to know we did a good job. We want to know that we made an impact. But with something like the Peace Corps, it may not have been someone that you had direct contact with, and it may be a story that you just never hear.
Yeah.
One thing that they always tell us is, well, is it you plant seeds to trees that you will never sit under the shade under. I'm paraphrasing badly, but you know, that you're impacting these young children that you're not going to know for generations. And as a volunteer in our area, met many people. Oh man, are you Peace Corps? I had a Peace Corps teacher once. And you hear that story and they light up of retelling that experience that they had with that volunteer. And on my bad days, you think, okay, maybe in 20 years, they'll think I had that Peace Corps volunteer.
Yeah.
We have only a few minutes left for this session, and there are people here with us who have not spoken. I don't know if any of you want to say anything.
I think Pam has a question, and she's in the picture. There's a picture of me and KJ. We were in Tanzania 2 years ago. We went on vacation, and the third person in the picture is Pam O'Callahan, And I think she has a question. Pam, unmute yourself.
Maybe she's gone away. Oh,
No,
okay.
I'm here. I'm triple tasking as I'm still trying to do my job. No, I just had a comment. I mean, I think the impact is, you know, you don't feel it when you're young and you're in country, but I mean, it's there all the time, and we can never judge the mark we left. You know, it's unbelievable. I mean, I interact with people in my job now, and have over and over again that, you know, I had a student that was born in Kasumo. I mean, it was just such a tie that, you know, just stays with you. That was my only comment.
Thanks, Pam.
You guys are doing an awesome job.
Great. Anyone else? Sharon, Tim, or Muffy? I know you weren't in the Peace Corps. Did you watch the film, and did you have any questions about the film? I'd like to hear. You better unmute yourself if you want to talk.
I was not in the Peace Corps. I was graduating from high school during the very early years of the Peace Corps. Went on to college, wasn't totally happy there after working way too hard my entire high school career. I knew about the Peace Corps, but I was painfully shy still at that point. And also I had always struggled with languages, and because I really did think about, you know, is that a possibility? Also at that time, I'm pretty sure this is going back to 64, 65, 66. You really needed to be a college graduate, and I wasn't. But I found the film, I found it very educational in terms of the history of, because there is a period that it sort of disappeared from whatever. And from time to time, I can't put my hands on it. I've met over my many years now, I've met a number of people who did do Peace Corps.
I was just thinking, I mean, I don't want, if anybody wants to add one more thing, otherwise I really would like to wrap it, but I don't want to stop any of you. Oh, look, somebody is.
I'll just make a comment. I was scheduled to depart for Armenia on March.
I got lose highest on.
March 14th. You know, I'm 50 plus. Peace Corps was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, and I'll be 62 this year, and so I thought, if I don't do this now, when am I going to do it? So the time was right. You know, prepared, sold everything, got rid of everything. 2 days before I'm to depart is when they, you know, pulled the plug on everything. So keeping my fingers crossed that I'll still be able to fulfill this desire, need that I have to serve. But, you know, things are out of my hands. So I'm just trying to have it be part of the journey. My great-grandparents immigrated from Armenia, so I did choose Armenia as the country, and I was going to teach English. They immigrated in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and so I just thought it'd be interesting to do that reverse immigration that the trip that my great-grandparents had done. So I'm hoping that I'll eventually be able to do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. So just to sum up, one thing that a thought that went through my mind as I was watching the film and towards the end, if you think of today, the whole ethos and the spirit of today's atmosphere in the United States, which is so much us against the world, it's them and us, it's a competitive thing, it's, you know, there's no collaborative spirit, we don't have a leadership who encourage us or set an example to do that. That's, in a way, I felt was a very relevant thing about the film, to show that, I'm not saying the Peace Corps doesn't exist today, but still, it came from an era where there was much more, we are part of the world, we are part of the United Nations. And so in that sense, I felt it was very pertinent today for people to watch the film and think about it. So,
and you don't have it in the film, but can I just add, when you are being evacuated from Peace Corps, and you know, it's within days, and you see the hurt from the people who are leaving because they're leaving their communities, you know that there's something there, right? Because they're just sobbing, you know, because they have to go. So I think it's a really good film. But there's another story out there.
Oh, there always are. No one film can tell all the stories. Otherwise, there would just be one film.
My final comment is that I've always had this fantasy, maybe because I'm a writer, I don't know, maybe I'll write this in a book someday, but how about a reverse Peace Corps? Maybe it's time now for Kenyans to come to America and show us what it's like to be a part of a community and caring for each other and sharing what little you might have and putting all your money together so someone can go to school. Like, America right now is obviously in a tremendous crisis, and there's stuff we can now learn from places that we've been going.
I think that's a great way to end it. And thank you all for participating, and thank you, Nancy and KJ and all the rest of you who I've just met. And if you haven't seen the film, do watch it, do tell others about it. And maybe we'll see you at another discussion after another film. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shirley. Thanks, everyone.
This was fantastic. I am so glad I got a chance to see some of you again.